Hi, I'm Paul Sonderegger, a data strategist at Oracle, and this is Data Capital, the Wealth of Information, a show about data, strategy, and technology. Data is a kind of invisible force coursing through almost everything in our modern lives, but even that doesn't do it justice. Let me see if I can make the world of data a bit more vivid for you. You're walking down the street one day when a guy comes up to you and makes you an offer. He'll give you some land. Whatever you do with this land is yours. Grow some crops, keep a wild forest, build a dam, make a lake, whatever. All yours. But there's a catch. Whatever you produce with this land, the guy also gets to use. But you'll never notice, because this is no ordinary land. It's magic. And this is no ordinary guy. He's a wizard. And he promises that whatever he does with your stuff for his own wizardy purposes won't disrupt your use. Everybody wins. This deal is probably too good to be true, but it's definitely too good to pass up. You say yes. And life in the magical land is good. You got wheat from your fields, timber from your forest, fish from your lake, and then you're out digging one day for gold or something when you discover a magic gem. When you look through it, you see what the wizard sees. And what you see is he's rented out your treetops to dragons, there are ogres fishing in your lake, and there's some kind of sprite infestation in your field. This does not look good. But what are you gonna do? You took the deal, and he's a wizard. So you go to see the king. And the king says, you have a point, and you're not the first person to show up here with a magic gem and some concerns. But here's the thing. Wizards, really useful, and frankly, we want to make sure that we have more of them than the next kingdom over. Same goes for dragons. But if any one of these dragons burns your field down, the king's got your back. So now what? Do you leave Dataland? Not many do. See, everybody in this arrangement, villagers, wizards, kings, they're all getting something they want, and something they really can't get anywhere else. But no one understands the full costs involved. Dataland is too good to give up, but it's too risky to be stable. Everybody wants this to work better, but how? This, admittedly, extensive allegory tells us something about our world. The digitization of nearly every activity in private, public, and commercial life means that we live in Dataland and the real world simultaneously. The introduction of this magical technical world into the one we can see and touch rewrites the social contract between people, companies, and governments. All three of these groups have overlapping claims, and often on exactly the same data. But they see that data from three different perspectives. For people, data is property. For companies, data is capital. And for governments, data is power. This is data's triple role. But creating new rules, technologies, and norms for managing these overlapping claims is not easy. And to figure out where we need to go, we first need to look more closely at the trade-offs involved. Start with the people. People think data about them belongs to them. This has an intuitive appeal. After all, observations about them are impossible without them. And people want control over these observations in order to safeguard their privacy. Privacy is part of the bedrock of open societies. The ability to control who knows what about you and your personality enables both individual liberty and public engagement, whether social, commercial, or political. Privacy is so important to modern complex societies that it's enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And those rights are recognized by the vast majority of nations in the world. However, data that people think belongs to them exists in systems owned by others, often companies. Creating data is a collaboration between the observer and the observed, even when it's an unequal one. Personal data is held in trust by companies, whether this is online browsing behavior or electronic medical records. And that data can't just sit idle, because for companies, data is capital. Now, this isn't a metaphor like data is the new oil, or data is the new gold, or data is a tree in a magical forest where wizards rent them out to dragons. No. Data fulfills the literal economic textbook definition of capital. Capital is a produced good, not a natural resource. More importantly, capital is a necessary input into other goods and services. It's what economists call an economic factor of production. If you don't have that factor, you can't build the product or service that you have in mind. And in some cases, entire companies cannot exist without the data they create and use. This is true of a wide variety of companies, everything from banks to wireless network operators to transportation and logistics firms. Not all data comes from interacting with consumers, of course. Firms also take observations of their own processes, their facilities, and their capital equipment. And this means that data is increasingly important to trading relationships between companies, like a manufacturer that wants to buy real-time shipping data from its top suppliers and distributors so it can run its just-in-time manufacturing line more efficiently. But this can be tricky, because data can be copied perfectly, infinitely. Once data has left the barn, it's difficult, if not impossible, to put it back. And so negotiating terms on this kind of data trade can take a long time, because companies fear risks like loss of intellectual property or misuse of the data by the other firm. And they wrangle over who has rights to derivative works like analytics or AI models trained up on the data they decided to share with each other. And this brings us to governments. Governments increasingly recognize these tensions between people and companies, and between one company and another. And they're creating new regulations and laws to govern these relationships, like Europe's General Data Protection Regulation and the European Data Act. Meanwhile, governments themselves face new challenges, because for them, data is power. This is particularly true of liberal democracies, where power derives from the consent of the governed. Here, the consent of the observed is essential for maintaining legitimacy in a world intertwined with data land. As a result, transparency about the creation, the use, the protection of data assets is crucial. Plus, governments face some of the same challenges as companies when sharing data across departments and agencies. Sharing data is necessary for a cross-agency collaboration, like in the direction of food, housing, and employment assistance for vulnerable families. However, in governmental structures where the separation of powers is part of maintaining checks and balances, data sharing can disrupt or even circumvent these careful designs. So all of these players, people, companies, governments, are all part of a larger system that sometimes benefits from the free flow of data and sometimes benefits from limits or barriers to those same flows. This sounds an awful lot like trade in the modern economy in every other kind of property, whether physical, like land, or intangible, like brands. But trade requires property rights, a public statement of ownership, and promise of enforcement. How do you bring enforceable property rights to an asset like data, which is not only intangible, but operates in a world that is mostly invisible? There's a legal side and a technical side. The legal side involves the declaration of data rights and responsibilities for each of the various stakeholders. This is unfolding right now in many nations across the world. It is an evolving and constantly changing patchwork of laws and regulations, but progress is being made. There's also significant advancement on the technical side. Transparent encryption that makes data safer at rest and in motion. Different kinds of blockchains that make specific pieces of data unique. And AI to monitor behavior inside of all these systems all play a role. But what's missing is a solution that makes data trade simple, low friction, and fair. A new foundation for data trade with protections for all stakeholders. But what kind of technical wizardry will make Dataland and the real world coexist more happily? And that's what this show is really about. How to reboot the data economy with a new system for fair data trade. And we'll look at this in a couple of different ways. We'll look at new ideas about data strategy and their implications for competitive strategy. We'll look at economic research that shows the impact of digitization, especially on the future of work. And we'll look at specific technologies and what they mean for the creation, use, and protection of data assets. To do that, we'll need a solid foundation for some key concepts like data, information, and knowledge. And to get that, we'll topple a familiar framework and put a new one in its place. Next time on Data Capital, the Wealth of Information.